Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if I could get your attention, please. Thank you. My name's Dick Benson. I'm the Dean of the College of Engineering, and I'm pleased that I'm not the only such person in the room today. There's another former Dean of the College of Engineering who's with us. So it is my great privilege to introduce the Hugh and Ethel Kelly Lecturer for 2015, which is presented through the auspices of the Institute for Critical Technology and Applied Science, or ICTAS. Roop Mahajan, the director, is here. So there's Roop. So thank you, Roop. This is a great, relatively new protocol that we have here. And also, this is a good point to say that at the end of the lecture, Roop will handle the Q&A with our speaker. So it is my pleasure to extend a warm welcome, a really warm welcome back to Wayne Clough. As I'm sure you know, Dr. Clough retired earlier this year as his secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian is the world's largest museum and research complex with activities in nearly 100 countries. Wayne held the position of secretary since 2008, and he took the Smithsonian in important new directions. He led the development of a comprehensive strategic plan, the first of its kind for the Smithsonian. The plan builds upon the Smithsonian's core strengths, renewing its commitment to education, understanding the causes and effects of global change, and expanding access to the Smithsonian's vast expertise and collections. In the process, the Smithsonian moved into a leadership role in the use of new digital communications and imaging technology. Wayne was responsible for an annual budget of $1 billion, 6,400 employees, and 6,200 volunteers. And you're going to have to ask him as to what fraction of the collection is alive. They also run the National Zoo and the like. The Smithsonian receives about 65% of its funding from the federal government while generating additional funding from private contributions and business revenues. As secretary, Wayne emphasized the development of collaborations with universities and organizations. Examples include the Global Tiger Initiative with the World Bank, accessioning of the Space Shuttle Discovery with NASA, and the Haiti Cultural Recovery Project with the State Department. One of my favorite university collaborations was with Virginia Tech, and it was the new and improved exhibit on bats, done with the help of Professor Rolf Mueller in mechanical engineering and Professor Dane Webster in the School of Visual Arts. I hope they're out in the audience. Another delightful collaboration between Virginia Tech and the Smithsonian involved the engineering of the Inca Road, led by Dr. Christine Fiore, formerly with the Myers-Lawson School of Construction. Before his appointment to the Smithsonian, Dr. Clough was the first Georgia Tech alumnus to serve as president of the university, a position he held for 14 years. And I have it on good authority that he was a hell of an engineer. The young Wayne Clough received his bachelor's and master's degrees, as noted, in civil engineering from Georgia Tech in 1964 and 65, and a doctorate in 1969 in civil engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. Mike Duncan, on our civil engineering faculty, was his graduate advisor. Wayne has received 9 honorary doctorates from universities in the U.S. and abroad. Wayne, a member of the National Academy of Engineering, was a member of the faculty at Duke University, Stanford University, and of course, most importantly, Virginia Tech. And I say that because he held my job as Dean of Engineering from 1990 until 1993. I have it on good authority that at one engineering commencement, Dean Clough quoted, or perhaps sang, a bit of Billy Ray Cyrus's Achy Breaky Heart. That must have been fun. So his title today is a more sober climate change, engineering, reality, and debate. Perhaps, though, if we get lucky, Dr. Clough will break into song and we can all join him in a line dance. So, Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Dick, for that great introduction. Am I on yet with the mic? Can you hear me okay? No? Better? Okay. Thanks, Dick, for the introduction, and thanks to Dick and Roop for inviting me here to participate in this special lecture series. I want to thank Eleanor Nelson, who works for Virginia Tech, who's been enormously helpful to us in the logistics involved in getting the presentation to the point it is. I think may or may not be here. She also has been very helpful. It's great to see so many people here, and I won't say so many old friends. I will say many who are young at heart, some of whom may have come to heckle me. I'm not just kidding. But it's nice to see everyone here on a rainy day. The topic is climate change. Did I lose you again? The topic is climate change. And it's a subject of interest to me. I'm not the expert on it as the basic science of it, but I have learned to talk about it because it's a subject I'm passionate about. And it really started particularly when I was president of Georgia Tech. And president of a school like that, people figured you knew a lot. And I would have alumni and others come up to me and say something, ask me a question about climate change. It often started this way. Dr. Clough, I think climate change is a bunch of bull. What do you think? So I had to defend it, if you will. And I found that I was not comfortable in stating the arguments very cogently. Now, the next experience that really got me into the subject was I was asked to chair a committee by the Department of Defense that would oversee the reconstruction of hurricane protection system for New Orleans. And in the course of that work, we realized how much money was going to be spent in the process of doing that. And it was going to amount to something on the order of $15 billion. And I asked a very simple question to the Corps of Engineers at one time. I said, how long do you want this to last? How long do you want this to last? Now, what would your answer be to that question if you were spending $15 billion on something? A long time. 100 years maybe, right? And so we had, fortunately, as a member of my panel, an expert on climate change. And so we turned to him and said, where will sea level be in 100 years? And he says it'll be at least 3 feet higher than it is today. And that had a big impact on our thinking about design. It was the first time I realized, particularly as a civil engineer, that climate change would have to be considered in the plans for projects in the future. And yet the answer to the question was in fact ambivalent, somewhere between 3 and 10 feet. And that's a pretty vague number to design. You have to choose one number or the other. So it was an interesting topic to me. That got me started on it, and I want to share this journey with you into this question of climate change, and particularly what the engineering role can be and should be. So let's go to the next slide. First, I think a lot of things are going on, so I want to share with you sort of an update, if you will, on the happenings in and around this topic of climate change. And you all realize that last week, of course, we had 2 dignitaries that visited the United States, Pope Francis and the president of China, Xi Jinping. And both of these gentlemen talked about climate change, and the Pope did with our Congress. And of course, not everybody in Congress has the same view about climate change as the Pope does. But in addition to that, before that, and last year was the first time there was a demonstration with 300,000 people walking down Fifth Avenue in New York City, demonstrating, saying somebody has to do something about climate change. And New York is familiar with the topic because it's on the shoreline and has just experienced Hurricane Sandy. Pope Francis, of course, visited with the president, and then the Pope Francis, as you may know, is a Jesuit by training, but as they say, a Franciscan by heart. And he wrote an encyclical called Laudato Si. And I suggest anyone who's interested in this topic to read that encyclical. It's actually not that long. And it's beautifully written from a point of view of science, but also because from his Franciscan side, the point of view of humanity. And his concern is that while you may or may not expect certain things out of climate change, whatever happens will be more prevalent and more devastating to people who have less means to deal with it. And that means both the people as well as the animals that share the planet with us. And he's a man of great compassion, and I think he spoke to this issue in a way most of us could not. And of course, the president of China was here with President Obama. Last year, they signed a historic agreement where which had not signed such an agreement before, committed themselves to reducing carbon emissions at a certain time scale. Now, whether or not they will actually do that's another question, but it was a commitment, and it was a relatively serious commitment. This time in their visit, when the president of China came here, they reinforced their commitment, and the president of China also made additional statements suggesting China is willing to go further than they had said the year before. And all of this is the run-up to the Paris summit, which will happen in November, where more commitments will be made, and I understand the UK just made a commitment this morning about reducing carbon levels. So there's a lot going on, and I think sometimes you get a little lost in all the changes that are happening. Let's go to the next slide. There are a lot of publications, and you can choose to read them or not, but there are a lot of things that you can learn by reading these publications. For example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that's sponsored by the United Nations has written a whole series of reports. The early reports are more criticized than perhaps the later ones because over time those reports have gotten more and more substantive. But you'll see the topics here. One of these deals with what's called adaptation, and one deals with mitigation. And the point I'm going to make a little later on is engineers are involved in both sides of this equation, adaptation and mitigation. So these are available to you for free to download on the internet. Next slide. If you don't want to work around the UN and their panels, well, how about the U.S.? Every 4 years we have something which is called a U.S. National Climate Assessment. The report was issued last year. It's a result of consultations with a whole list of government agencies, Defense Department, Agriculture, Interior, and indeed the Smithsonian. I wanted the Smithsonian to be part of this dialogue. And it says climate change, once considered an issue for the distant future, has moved firmly into our present. The next one of these will be issued in 3 more years. But it's a very meaningful report. Again, you can download it for free. Good reading. Next slide. In addition, the Present administration has required every government agency to issue an adaptation report. And adaptation means how will you adapt to what happens, not how you will stop what's happening, but how you will adapt to what might happen. And each agency has written such a report. Now on the left-hand side, this is actually, it's hard to see, this is the National Academy of Engineering's report, which was issued probably in 2010 or 11 on adaptation. And it's a very well-written report. Again, it's free if you download it on a computer. But every agency has one of these adaptation reports, and the two that are shown here, one is agriculture and the other is the Department of Defense. The Smithsonian had to write one too, and I'll comment briefly on that one a little bit later on. I like the Department of Defense and the Department of Agriculture. I like defense because right now some people might have argued before they wrote that report, these, sometimes the pointy-headed intellectuals are making something out of something that maybe shouldn't be. But when the guys with guns say, this is serious, probably pretty serious. With the Defense Department, you don't think about it, but right here in Virginia, one of the most vulnerable places for our Defense Department with one of their most potent forces in their military is the Newport News shipyard and the Navy Yard there. And it's highly vulnerable because Norfolk, it turns out, is one of the areas most susceptible to sea level rise because of upwelling and currents. So when you read the Defense Department report, it's very clear our security will be at risk and will be actually made more difficult in the future because of droughts, because of water shortages, because of the Arctic ice disappearing and the Russians taking over more and more of the land in the Arctic and so forth. This is a big deal report, and it's free. Get it? The Agriculture Department I like because we all have to eat and drink to survive. This is a report about basic survival. And the fact of the matter is the Agriculture Department is very concerned about the influence of climate change on whether or not we will have sustenance and we will have water. Very important. So an excellent set of reports that I encourage you to take a look at. And they're free if you download them on your computer. Let's go to the next slide. Now I want to share with you a little bit about my experience at the Smithsonian from both the land, in water, and in space points of view. The Smithsonian, most people know it through the great museums that are on the mall, but in fact it has 500 PhD scientists that work in 130 countries around the world on all kinds of subjects. It has one of the world's largest astrophysical observatories. The headquarters is in Cambridge, but it has observatories on the tops of mountains around the world. It runs satellites for NASA. It's a very big science organization. And I had the great good fortune to be the secretary. It's an amazing institution, and I say this to you because many people don't realize how amazing it is. There is nothing like it in the world. I can guarantee you that. And you own it. You help pay for it because part of the expenses are paid by the American taxpayer. Partly it all earns its own money, and it has to do that. But it is an amazing institution with great science behind it. And I want to share with you a little bit of my experiences with the scientists because I had the chance to visit many of these scientists in the locations where they were doing the science around the world. And I saw a lot of different points of view regarding the effects of climate on different parts of our world. So let's go to the next slide. So first thing we're going to do is talk about keeping a hand on the Earth's pulse. This is so-called Forest Geo. So this is the Global Earth Observatory the concept was started by the Smithsonian back in the 1960s and 70s out of its Tropical Research Institute in Panama, but it's spread all over the world today. It's a very simple way to measure what's happening to a forest and to translate those measurements back to the Smithsonian and for people to share that data around the world. It's now in 61 different locations in over 20 countries. Scientists all over the world sending the data to the Smithsonian, which it shares back with scientists in the world. So we can see what's happening to forests. And what we see is that forests are changing. Forests are changing due to increased carbon levels. Forests are actually moving up mountains in transition zones because they're moving towards the cooler zones in the mountains that are moving up the mountains and disappearing from the lower area. So what we see in forest is the forests are changing. Forests are changing because of the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere. Next slide. We also work in the oceans, and I had the good fortune to visit this place. And this small island is Caribou Key. It's off the shore of Belize. It's surrounded by magnificent coral reefs, both shallow reefs and deep reefs on this side. Those reefs are in trouble. Reefs all over the world are in trouble. What we're going to emphasize as I go through this talk is the idea of winners and losers. Coral are one of the losers because coral are sensitive to temperature. They're an animal. It's sensitive to temperature and it's sensitive to pH. And both those are going up, and coral know it. And over 50% of the coral in the world are either lost or about to be lost. These coral are in better shape than many others. Not just the climate, but due to other reasons, but particularly due to climate. Coral is in trouble. Why is coral important? Because 70% of the fisheries, the fish hatcheries, if you will, for natural fish, are in coral reefs. If we lose the coral reefs, we lose our fish sources. Everything is connected. Everything is connected. So I had a chance to snorkel and see this beautiful area. This is Mary Hagedorn. She's so concerned about coral, she is saving their reproductive tissue in hopes that she can replant it someday when conditions are better. She's cryogenically storing the reproductive tissue of coral. Big problems then emerging in the ocean. Next slide. How about from outer space? Well, from outer space looking back to Earth, this is Panama, that's the isthmus, and the Smithsonian's been working there for over 110 years. These red areas are areas where the tropical forests have good health, and that is they're acting as a carbon sink, as we hope they would. The blue areas are areas where humans have taken over, created agricultural fields, and taken away the capacity to absorb carbon. So what we see is that carbon sinks are disappearing because forests are disappearing. Now, forests aren't the only carbon sink, oceans are. But you can see very clearly we've lost a big portion of the carbon sink that once was in the tropical forest of Panama. And we can see forests disappearing around the Chesapeake Bay and other places. So forests are disappearing, and that's a concern to us as well. Next slide. The Smithsonian is also home to collections, the greatest collections in the world, particularly in science, 128 million specimens. Many things you will never see in the museums. You may not want to see every tick in the world, but the Smithsonian has one of everything. It also has many what are called amphibians, and in this case, what I'm looking at with Jeremy Jacobs, who's a great curator, has been there 40 years, at salamanders. And these salamanders happen to come from South Georgia. They have salamanders from Virginia. They have salamanders from the Blue Ridge Mountains. And what they're seeing as they document these salamanders over the years is they're getting smaller, consistently getting smaller. That's not a tragedy. Yeah, salamanders are salamanders, but they're getting smaller because of climate change. So something is happening in the natural world that's affecting the size of salamanders. It's affecting the nature of forests. It's affecting coral, and it's affecting our forests that we see them today. So natural systems are reacting both to temperature and to increased carbon. Those are two factors. Next slide. So let's take a little bit about our research that's going on, and not just at the Smithsonian, but as I'll show you here at Virginia Tech and many other places. Clearly we can study current changes, and that's what I was just talking about. We can go to places like Alaska, where things are happening more rapidly than they are here. Temperature in Blacksburg has gone up on the average 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years. But 3 degrees in Alaska is more severe there than it is here. You'll see the effect of that in a moment. And of course, there are models that are out there. Let's talk a little bit about prior episodes of global warming here for a moment that relates to Smithsonian research. Next slide. Next slide, please. I'm standing in a place called the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming. It's near a small town that's famous for a beer called Moose Drool. And if you ever have a chance to drop by this area, this is where Butch Cassidy used to live. They have great beer called Moose Drool. I guarantee you'll enjoy it if you like beer. But this is an area where a deposition was made from the Bighorn Mountains and created the Bighorn Basin. The unique thing about the Bighorn Basin is it was then uplifted, and the streams cut deep into those sediments. And what that allows scientists to do is to look back in time as they look into those layers and see what's happened over time. A friend of mine named Scott Wing has been doing this for 25 years, and he was interested in a period called the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum. This occurred when the Earth was moving out of the period of the Paleocene epoch into the Eocene, about 55 million years ago. And it turns out at that time something dramatic happened in the climate, and the question was why, and I'll comment on what that meant in a minute. He found out there was a bed called the Big Red, and he could find information from plant fossils that would help him understand what happened, and he could actually measure the carbon sources that were emitted at the time. So it could tell you precisely why global warming occurred related to the carbon sources. And that's Scott. I love these scientists at the Smithsonian. Scott goes out there every year and camps out with about 20 students and other faculty in a campsite. And they do their research in the field, and then they take their work back and work in their laboratories. This is a SLIM. They let me discover a fossil. Of course, they handed me a rock where they knew a fossil was in it. Anyway, when I cracked it open, and it was a fossil. And this is a SLIM. You can't quite see it, but SLIMs are found in semi-tropical environments. So Wyoming today is not a semi-tropical environment, but it was 55 million years ago. So let's take the next slide, and we'll take a look at this period called the PETM, or Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum. About 55, 56 million years ago, between these two geologic epochs, 4,000 to 7 billion tons of carbon were emitted over a series of millennia, thousands of years, if you will, several thousand years. That's a lot of carbon, and I'll comment on that in just a minute. Where did all that carbon come from? Not humans. The argument about humans is not even there. It came from a series of massive volcanic eruptions that emitted an enormous amount of carbon. Those carbon deposits then triggered the melting of the tundra in the Arctic, and because there's a great deal of vegetation in that melting process emitted an enormous amount of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which in turn imbalanced the carbon cycle on Earth, and the methylsilicates in the ocean gave up their carbon. An enormous, amazing period of time. What happened when that happened? Carbon dioxide levels went over 1,000 parts per million. Remember that number. Global warming was 5 to 8 degrees C. We just said warming has already occurred here on the Earth of 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, about 0.8 degrees C. But 5 to 8 is a big number. Marine chalk dissolved. Now that's a technical term. And for those of us in the audience, most of us, what it means is the oceans were so acidic that shellfish could not make shells. And so when you drill down into the ocean bed 55 million years ago, you find no shells, because the ocean was way too acidic to allow that to happen. Now we can ask ourselves, is anything like that happening today? And I'll answer that question a little bit later. It lasted about 100 to 200,000 years before the Earth rebalanced things. So is this a big number or not? As an engineer, I always ask myself, is that a big number or a little number, right? Turns out it's a big number. But let's put it in perspective. In 2014 rather, we humans emitted in our carbon cycle 40 billion tons of carbon last year. Now, if you do that for 100 years in a row, that's the number you get. And we're doing it in 100 years, not thousands. So where we are in our life cycle, we're emitting carbon at a far greater rate than occurred 56 million years ago. And when it got done, something dramatic happened to the Earth. And you can see some of these things, like those things, are pretty staggering and amazing. Next slide. Of course, sea level rose because all the ice on the Earth disappeared. Now, here's another example of winners and losers. Because if you're a state in the United States and you were existing at that time, They're losers. What's the loser here? Florida. Florida's gone. Yeah. Now, the winner here is really interesting to me because I grew up right here, Douglas, Georgia. Douglas, Georgia, it turns out, is at elevation 252. Sea level supposedly rose about 250 feet from where it is today, so Douglas, Georgia was Daytona Beach 56 million years ago. So if you're a long-term investor, Douglas might be a good place to buy some land. So sea level is coming up. Now, the other losers are all the cities on the coast of either coast of the United States. They're all gone. They're all gone. If sea level rises that much, they're gone. They just don't exist anymore. We built them up in the last 100 years. They can't move, and so they will disappear. Winners and losers. Now, let's take a look, though, at Canada and Nunavut up here. Their biggest province, their most northern province. What would that have looked like 56 million years ago? Next slide. This. That's what it looks like today. That's where I grew up, the Okefenokee Swamp. I know all about that. I don't know much about that. But 56 million years ago, Nunavut looked like that. So times changed drastically as a result of the pedum. So it's a model, it's an interesting model to look at, scientists to compare it to what we may be doing to ourselves today. Next slide. So we say, welcome to the Anthropocene. Geologic epochs, we talked about Eocene and Paleocene. Back down here as we get closer into our time, Pleistocene, then there was the Holocene. And Holocene, we have to say goodbye, we barely knew you because it only lasted for 11,000 years and we just got over it. So this is the new one. It may be here, it hasn't quite been made official. This is a period when something is happening with humans that will last forever. So what is it we're doing that if someone were here 600 million years from now, they would see we were here? They would find plastic. We invented it in 1925, and there's no evidence there's anything that makes it go away. So there would be a big layer of plastic saying this humans were here. There would be carbon black because we had the Industrial Revolution and we burned so much carbon. There would be a high level of radioactivity because we set off so many bombs and we created a layer of radioactivity. That's what the human race is leaving behind at this stage. We will leave something better than that, I hope. But that's called the Anthropocene. If you like a fancy word, you can use that. We now live in the age of humans. Next slide. So let's look at this timeline a little bit and give you a framework for it. So over here, you're 10,000 years before now. And those are early humans, for example, arriving into the New World. And what they found were megafauna like mastodons and mammoths and all kinds of large animals. And what they did, what humans usually do when they see something like that, they kill them. And were eliminated. And 10,000, probably 8,000 years ago, they were all eliminated. They used to be right here in Virginia and Georgia, but they're all gone because humans decided they could eat them, and they figured out a way to kill them. That was early humans. That was what they did. Then in 1800, that's about right here, Industrial Revolution starts. Now over here you have about 1 million people. Here you have about 1 billion people. From here up until present, we have operated on the basis of a carbon economy. We have used engine, motors, we've made plastic, we've done everything that involved petroleum. So that's our time here from 1800 to here is carbon-based economy. What happens from present to the future is an interesting question, but from here to here, we added 6 billion humans. And most of those humans live within 50 miles of the coast. Most of them live within 50. And so we built our infrastructure right next to the oceans, right? Or in places maybe they shouldn't be there. That's the human being part of the equation. We added 6 billion people, all using a carbon-based economy. It's estimated we'll add another 3 or 4 billion people if the Earth stays around in the next 50 to 100 years. They cannot use carbon-based fuel like we have. They cannot, because the Earth will not survive it. So we have to change in some way. We have to be ready for it. This is the ocean story, and I won't tell that because it's a similar story. Next slide. Let's just look at the data real quickly. You've seen it debated. These are our change from the average in terms of Fahrenheit temperatures, and the early part of the centuries in 1800s, early 1900s were coolish. It's definitely been warming since then, and as you know, even though it's getting cold outside, this is going to be the hottest year on record, and it's the hottest year in a series of hot years and decades and so forth. So the temperatures are going up. And remember the Eocene, the pedum, 5 to Well, it turns out 2 degrees, if it stayed around long enough, 2.5 degrees would melt all the ice on Earth. So we got to think about that, where this is going. Next slide. Carbon, parts per million. Remember in the Pedum, it was up here at 1,000. We started out at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution at about 260. 1960, it was close to 300. We just went over in August of 2015, 400. 400. There's some people who argue that 480 is a really telling stage. Where are we relative to that? There's some people that argue 580, the world really will change if it happens. We have to be concerned about this level of carbon going into the atmosphere. Next slide. Oceans, the great sink for all of our problems that we have, including carbon. It's an enormous carbon balance. The carbon cycle wants to be balanced. And if it has to be balanced by absorbing carbon into the ocean, it will do it. But of course, what that does is acidify the ocean. And of course, because water is actually melting on glaciers and the sea level has warmed up and it expands, sea level will rise. And it's only gone up 3 inches since 1992, but it's more than that if you look over a longer period of time. So our oceans right now are protecting us from what we're doing. Next slide. Not all creatures in the ocean, however, see it that way. I've already mentioned corals, but there's something beautiful thing called sea butterfly. It's a little creature about tiny like that, and it has a shell, and it swims. And if you've ever seen pictures of it, it looks just like a butterfly, just a beautiful, beautiful thing. But that little shell is a very thin shell. Remember the story about the Pedum. Well, these shells are already deteriorating. And these little creatures, particularly in the Arctic where it sorbs, and Antarctic where it sorbs carbon more easily than it does in the tropics, these little creatures are having a hard time swimming. If they can't swim, they can't catch food, they can't eat. Well, they are part of the food chain. And when they're gone, the next level of the food chain suffers. And so a good example of that here, reported by NOAA, is salmon are going to lose their food supply. So when these little guys start disappearing, and they are disappearing, you've got a problem. Next slide. We talked a little bit about other shellfish. This is a owner of Taylor Shellfish in Seattle. Some of you here are from Seattle. Seawater conditions are getting such that they're dissolving our animals, and the source of the problem is carbon emissions. What we saw in the Pedum is happening now. It's a serious problem. It's a serious problem with the larvae also, that as they're born, they can't survive in the pH level. So we're beginning to see signs that should be warning signs to us in our oceans. Next slide. Of course, I mentioned corals, and there's a scientist at Georgia Tech, Kim Cobb, who's done a great job of looking at corals and using them as a detector of previous climate changes. And they conclude, for example, that we're going to see larger El Niños. And in fact, the next one that's coming right now may be one of the very largest of all times. And that increases the imbalance of things in our Earth's climate. So we know this by examining corals over a range of years. Next slide. And so this is information from NOAA, and this is a prediction from the next El Nino. And if you have dark red, that's alert level 2. Alert level 2 says mortality likely. That means corals are going to die. And so as the oceans get hotter and hotter and more acidic, corals get to be more and more in trouble. And this El Nino in this coming year is going to have a significant effect if it is as big as they are possibly predicting now. Next slide. I mentioned sea level rise, and we looked at it for over a short period of time. This is 1870, and it's estimated to have gone up about 8 to 9 inches, depending upon which gauge you use. That's not a lot. You know, that's just 8 to 9 inches. I mean, after all, 20,000 years ago, sea level was 400 feet below where it is today. And it came up over time, gradually, as the glacial interlude disappeared. But it's the trend here that gets you concerned. It's trending like that. And it gets concerning when you see that. Next slide. Receding glaciers, of course, we heard stories, and people will have competing stories. No, I know of one that's advancing, but most of them are receding. And if you're like me and you love Glacier National Park, and I was there 25 years ago, my wife and I were, I saw glaciers then that were far bigger than the glaciers I saw 2 years ago. And USGS now is suggesting if you want to see glaciers at Glacier National Park, you've got about 20 years to see them because they're disappearing. They're melting. Next slide. This question of sea level rise is an interesting one. You know, how high will the seas go up? So it comes the question, where's this water going to come from? Right now, as I mentioned, it's just a minor bit of glacial melting. Sea ice in the Arctic doesn't matter because it floats. It's really the sea ice on land, and that's Greenland, and it's Antarctica. This is a trip I had a chance to make to the South Pole. I'm standing at the location of the South Pole. I'm at elevation 9,500. Land elevation where I'm standing is 500. I'm standing on top of 9,000 feet of ice. 9,000 feet of ice is a lot of water. This stuff starts melting, sea level can go up very quickly. And remember in the Pedum, it was gone. Next slide. Well, you'll hear talk about Antarctica, and it's a continent, of course, is West Antarctica and East Antarctica. Most of the concern has been on glaciers on West Antarctica in the past, but more recently, East Antarctica, where the bigger glaciers are. And part of the problem is some of these glaciers, like the Totten Glacier, have sea level water getting underneath it, and it's melting those glaciers. And as those glaciers start melting, there's a lot of water that can come out. If Totten Glacier melted, they estimate sea level will go up 10 feet. Next slide. Okay, what does that mean already to us? Well, I mentioned Norfolk, Virginia, your naval base right here in Virginia, has got problems. Because while sea level has gone up on average 8 to 9 inches, it's 1.5 foot in Norfolk because of upwelling and currents. And already they're having frequent episodes of flooding in the tunnels, at the Chrysler Museum, and other places. If you go to Washington, D.C., and you go to a restaurant in Georgetown, 3 or 4 times a year now, you can't go to your favorite restaurant because water is coming up in the rivers, the tidal rivers around Washington, D.C. So sea level is inching up and beginning to make its presence known. Next slide. Now let's talk about the other thing that is something of concern to engineers, civil engineers particularly, surge. We just talked about general increases, but when you have a hurricane, you have a surge. And I mentioned I was involved with the Hurricane Katrina efforts, and others were as well. And this was just to remind you that obviously this was in New Orleans. That was our report that we wrote. And this was a big Cat 5 hurricane. It was a Cat 3, Category 3 when it hit. Let's take a look at the surge effects from Katrina. Next slide. So Katrina had a track that looked something like this. It came charging up, and then for New Orleans, which is right over here, it's the worst of all possible circumstances because the hurricane circulates this way, and as it came up this way, it hit Lake Bourne. They got a surge from Lake Bourne, and it kept going up, and then it came down this way to hit Lake Pontchartrain to the north, and they got 2 surges from the hurricane. Next slide. These marks here all represent places where the levees failed, and they failed almost everywhere. It was not a good deal, not a good performance whatsoever. Out of Lake Bourne, you had a 25-foot surge. So on top of sea level rise, you had a 25-foot level surge, and it obliterated the levees. They just weren't designed well to withstand that. The surge out of Lake Pontchartrain came down these inner city canals, and that surge was probably around 18 or 19 feet. So surges are big and can be quite additive to increases in sea level. Next slide. And of course, we know the story. New Orleans City was flooded. 2,200 people died. $15 billion to reconstruct the hurricane protection system. But in the whole area, you know, it was $160 billion in losses. Now, that was a wake-up call in some ways, but not entirely, because a lot of people told me, when I told them about sea level rise and concerns, they said, well, people in New Orleans are crazy. Like they kind of deserved it. I thought, well, that's interesting, but it could happen in other places. And we don't really need to see 2,200 people die, especially the poorest of the poor, the most disabled, and the elderly. What kind of country are we if we don't care about people? And so this is a problem with our hurricane protection mentality. We wait until it happens. That's not a good thing. Next slide. Now, the Corps of Engineers rebuilt this system. It's a really fantastic system. It's strong, it's resilient. The only slight problem is it will be overtopped in a Hurricane Katrina. And the reason is it wasn't designed for Hurricane Katrina. It was designed by FEMA to a 100-year flood level, which is not Katrina. And so it's going to be overtopped eventually, but it won't collapse. And so New Orleans has to keep their evacuations plans current, because even with this $15 billion system in place, the lesson here is you can't build a wall high enough sometime if nature is taking charge, okay? Next slide. Well, where the story got a little richer was Hurricane Sandy. And when Hurricane Sandy hit New York and New Jersey, which the most damage was done, it was a Category 2, not a Category 5 or 3. But it stayed there a long time, and it was a big reach. And of course, almost 100 people died here, and again, $100 billion worth of damage. But this, you can't really say the people in New York deserved it, can you? New Orleans people chose to live below sea level, but New York, not really. And so New York was kind of more of a wake-up call than Katrina was. In New York, they had a storm surge of about 15 feet. 15 feet, on top of a sea level increase. And, next slide, that led to, oh, sorry, go back one if you could. All right, and that led to, obviously, lower New York flooding and losing its electricity for about 2 weeks. The subway was flooded. Amazing event, and woke up a lot of people there. Next slide. The Smithsonian has most of its museums in Washington, but it has two museums in New York City, one of which is down in the Battery area, the American Indian Museum. It was flooded, the bottom floor was flooded. I had people who stayed there. We told them to get out, but they would not leave their artifacts. They said they're too precious to lose, and they stayed on the second floor, and the first floor was flooded, and they fortunately got out. This is a huge, big deal, and now New York is spending $30 billion in adaptation plans. Next slide. I will give them credit. They're doing something smart. They decided they can't build walls everywhere. So they're building all kinds of parks, and it's called the Dry Line by Bjarke Ingels Group. Bjarke Ingels is a great young man. And so what they're trying to do is do something very creative to create flood protection that's not a big wall that's so ugly and separates the city. But this thing will not stop a big hurricane either. But at least it's a start, and it's a very creative idea about how you protect the city. Next slide. I mentioned Alaska. Alaska is in more trouble than all the rest of us. 5 million acres already this year, which dwarfs anything you've read about in the papers about the lower 48. 3 degrees C increase in temperature. And in addition to burning the tundra, it's melting the permafrost, which is releasing carbon dioxide and methane that's been there for thousands of years. So it has a double whammy. So Alaska is being hit more by global warming than other areas are. Next slide. I've been there, Ann and I both have, and I met with the elders of the Yupik tribe, and these folks live on St. Lawrence Island in Bering Strait. And we spent 2 hours with them talking about their fear of climate change. And they were not ungrounded, because those people are being asked to leave their homes now, because their permafrost is melting, their shoreline eroding, coming right into them. They can't follow their traditional hunting pattern, and their culture is being destroyed. Well, you can see we're already seeing people in areas that are close to the sea evacuating, leaving their homes. And you're going to see that more often in the future. Next slide. Alaska's glaciers, of course, are losing tremendous amount of water. And President Obama visited this site. This is a sign that says Exit Glacier was here about 10 years ago. It's up here now, and it's happening all over Alaska. Next slide. Okay. We should be concerned, very concerned, in my opinion. Industrial Revolution, we were at 280 parts per million in carbon. We have reached 400 very quickly, higher than at any time in the last 15 million years. The current emission rates will reach 560 by 2100. At 560, all of the ice melts. Now, it'll take a little while for it to do it, but it'll all melt because it's bound to do it. And sea level will be 25 meters higher. Who's going to build a wall 80 feet high? You can't do it. Can't do it. That's why engineers have got to get into this conversation. We cannot protect people. And our code of ethics, civil engineers out there, what does it start with? Our first responsibility is public safety. We have to tell people we cannot protect them from sea level increases like that. They may think we can, but we cannot. Next slide. All right, so here's President Obama and his statement recently in September. Those trend lines continue, people will suffer, economies will suffer, entire So for severe problems and so on. And he's correct. Next slide. I will just show you what this looks like. 3 foot sea level. If you want to go visit a Smithsonian Museum in, say, 2030, you'll have to get in a boat. Because Washington is a very low-lying city, and you got a problem. Next slide. If you get 20 feet or so, or 25 feet of sea level, and you go visit Jefferson and his monument, you're going to get your feet wet. That's what's going to happen in that area. Next slide. So, the Corps of Engineers, taking the resources they have decided to do what they can to protect Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and museums with treasures that could never be replaced if they were lost. And so on 17th Street, a very important artery, right next to the tidal basin, here's Jefferson Memorial, and here's the Washington Monument here and the World War II Monument. 17th Street goes up right here to the White House. That's the lowest point in Washington, with one exception, and that is going this way on Constitution Avenue. It's going this way, okay? So when the seas rise, or when the water rises due to a storm surge, it comes up in the tidal basin and goes up 17th Street and goes down that way. First, it'll go other ways after that. So the Corps of Engineers has said, what we'll do is we're going to go to 17th Street. Now, you've all been on 17th Street. You may not know it, but you have been. And they're putting in walls on either side of 17th Street that can be stop-logged when they see a surge coming. Now, this project, they're investing $10 million. New York City's investing $30 billion. So is $10 million going to get it done? This wall is 9 feet high. And it is, guess what, right there. That's not going to protect this part of Washington, right? Nice idea. Might as well do something. Washington's going to have to spend a lot of money sooner or later on protection. But that's what they're doing today. Next slide. Smithsonian Buildings, I'll just tell you, here's the tidal basin. The water comes out of the tidal basin and comes down Constitution. There's American history and natural history. They've both been flooded already. We have at the Smithsonian the world's best sandbagging crew. That's their protection. They can get sandbags out there in a hurry and hope that holds. Building a brand new museum right there, the African American History and Culture Museum. Same problem for that museum. Next slide. Okay, what can we do? Adaptation, I mentioned. Mitigation is essential. And so there are a series of reports about mitigation from the National Academy of Engineering. Again, I asked you, read them. They're free. Download them on the computer and read them. Next slide. What is mitigation? It's using technology to reduce the use of fossil fuel, improving and expanding renewable energy, making existing technology more energy efficient, protecting and expanding carbon sinks that absorb greenhouse gases. These are things we can do something about, and engineers actually are pretty active, and scientists, in trying to do something about that. Next slide. So here's a good example, incidentally, from those of us in the business, guys, civil engineers. This is an opportunity area. Because no matter what, we're going to have to build walls and berms, and we're going to have to go into all kinds of mitigation technologies we never had to before. So there is opportunity on this side, and it's a good thing to do. Next slide. I mentioned sustainability, and this is a little embarrassing, but this happened to, they named a building after me. That's kind of embarrassing. But at Georgia Tech, the last building I had anything to do with was a LEED Platinum building. At the Smithsonian, the last building I had anything to do with, the Matthias Lab, is a LEED Platinum building. We can all build LEED Platinum buildings, and they're fun. They're a lot more creative to design and build. And they save a lot of money, and they save an enormous amount of energy and carbon. Next slide. Climate change mitigation research. I'm proud of the institution I was president of at one time, and I'm now associated with. I went there, and I said, let me find a list of all those organizations working on mitigation. And I got this list, and it's really an impressive list of things. And I've been visiting the heads of these organizations, and I said, did you know so-and-so working on this problem? No. But see, what engineers do is they work on their own problem. And they're all thinking about their own problem. We need to think bigger than our own problems if we're going to really be in the game. Next slide. And sure enough, right here at Virginia Tech, you got a really impressive list of folks working on mitigation. And you look across the board here. They're all engaged, and I've visited several of these today, the Institute for Critical Technology and Applied Science, doing some really remarkable things that will affect mitigation. In other words, they're slowing the train down, trying to give us a little time to react to this system. And all these folks are doing these things. But they are not thinking about the big problem. How do you stop How do you stop carbon from reaching 480 or 500 parts per million? Is what Georgia Tech is doing and Virginia Tech doing enough to make a dent? We don't know the answer to that question, but we need to know the answer to that question. And engineers need to answer that, not somebody else. Next slide. Pope Francis got it right in his new encyclical. I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we're shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect all of us. I think he's right. And I think it could start with engineers having a dialogue among themselves to see if we're doing enough to make a dent in the question of 2 degrees C or 500 parts per million. Is it enough? We have to ask ourselves that question. Next slide. Bottom line, this is the last slide. Climate change is occurring now, and some significant future changes are already inevitable. That is, we built in a carbon machine. It's still pumping it out. And even if we got really serious about everything today, we would still pump it out for a long time. Human use of carbon-based fuels is a major driver of climate change. Doing nothing is not an option. Adaptation without mitigation is impossible. It doesn't work. Civil engineers cannot build walls high enough. Can't work. And finally, engineers need to be leaders in the dialogue, not followers, but we have to get educated about the issues. We have to understand what our scientific brethren are saying, and they have to understand what we're saying. And we have to talk to our policy friend and the other folks who can help us in the political world. So with that, I'm going to conclude and hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Please give another big hand for a very thought-provoking and inspiring lecture by Dr. I'm sure he'll be taking some questions, but before we do that, I would like to invite Eleanor Nelson, ICTA's communication manager, for her stellar efforts in making this event a possibility.
Absolutely.
Eleanor. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank ICTA staff, including program managers, administrative staff, our IT staff, or anybody else I have missed, for their tiring effort in making today's event a possibility. They navigated us through the different paths in the rainy season from one building to another. Thank you very much. Please give them a hand. I would also like to thank Dean Benson and the College of Engineering for the joint stewardship of this event, Kelly Lecture Series, Distinguished Kelly Lecture Series. President Sands, Provost Thanasis, thank you for hosting lunch and spending some time with Dr. Clough.
Thank you.
And of course, for all of you, thank you very much, dear audience, my friends and colleagues and members of the audience, for your patient listening. And I'm truly hoping that some neurons are running in your brains thinking about what Dr. Clough has said, and maybe we'll take the opportunity to take or do some engineering, or at least do a little bit that we can do to meet this challenge. But anyway, before I'll close this talk, I would like to open the forum for question and answer. I'm sure you'll be able to take some. So this is the time for question and answer, and I think we have the speakers, microphones available for the audience. All right. All right, let's start with the questions. Okay, please.
One of the major problems is going to be the movement of human populations as water supplies fail to just the glaciers alone. They're gone. The glaciers from in the Himalayas will mean that there's not enough water available for anything resembling the population that lies underneath. And that's only one of several dozen cases of that character. The movement of human populations in the RC now illustrates the kind of disaster.
Yes.
That's the issue dealt with in several dimensions.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. You want to repeat that?
The question is about what happens with the increase in the human population. with the glaciers melting, what will happen to the water supply? And he would like to know from Dr. Clough his comments on that.
Well, it's a very good question, and that's another reason we want to have some time if we can. Let me get out of this area over here. We need as much time as we can get to adapt as well as we can, because we're going to have to adapt and mitigate. And so if we had suddenly to evacuate the entire population of New York City, we'd be in serious problems like you see now in Greece and the middle, in the Caribbean and Mediterranean area. But what's going to happen with the indigenous peoples like Yupik people, they're going to be relocated, and they're going to lose their indigenous culture because it's based on living in a certain place and living in a certain way. So that's already happening. That's a social sciences issue. It's an issue that we're going to be facing more and more with these most vulnerable communities that exist there. Obviously, the Maldives and some of the islands out in the Pacific are in the same boat. Bangladesh will also be a big problem because many people there will be facing this problem more severely in the future. The question about in the United States, that gets kind of ticklish is, are you going to ask people to quit using their beach houses and things of that sort? We've struggled with that, and I think we found it's hard to do until people realize it's impossible to keep their beach houses. Some of it just has to be learned the hard way, and that's the only thing I can conclude about what's going to happen there. In New Orleans, my committee recommended that the city consider not allowing relocation into the Ninth Ward and the Lakeview areas, which are both 8 feet below sea level, and they were swamps before they were filled in. And that was fairly roundly rejected, particularly by the politicians and by the people who live there. And my wife has cousins who moved right back in. They love their homes, and very difficult to keep people out of their homes, even though they put themselves in harm's way. And that's why you have to continue to have evacuation plans for people who are going to be in places that literally are more vulnerable than most of us would like. So I think it's a tough one. Remember, if engineers all got together and thought they knew the answer, that won't be the answer, because politicians make the decision. And so we have to be very persuasive in our arguments. We have to be, and I think we have to understand what Pope Francis is saying. We have to be very humane in our approaches to these things and appreciate people's values and people's desires. So I don't have the answer to it. I think it is going to be a challenging problem, and we want it if it's going to come, it should come to us slowly. We may conclude there are some cities and some portions of cities you cannot protect. They're just too vulnerable.
Okay. Another question? Yes, please.
Hey, Walter.
Thanks for a great job here putting this problem into context. More than I've ever seen. Thank you very much. And I really like your statement that mitigation is what we need to think about. Engineers think about mitigation. Where do we start? Where's the most productive area we can start with this, and how effective we can be?
So the question is on mitigation, and Professor Walter Bryan is asking, where do we start and how effective can we be?
Well, I think we've made, the good news is mitigation efforts in some areas without really thinking through the climate change equation have made a lot of progress. So solar cells would be one. We really started out wanting to develop better solar cells, thinking we'd save money and thinking it was the right thing to do. There was, quote, less pollution. I don't think when we started out we were thinking about climate change. Today, though, we can see that's a component dealing with climate change. Today, what we know, we also know in this country, particularly market forces are going to drive a lot of these things. In some countries, Germany, for example, they said, we're going to have solar cells. And they gave such big subsidies to it now. I've heard 40% of their energy now comes from solar. France, of course, a significant amount of their energy comes from nuclear. And that was a conscious decision on their part. And that's non-carbon based kind of fuel. Here, it's going to be market driven. Now, I understand that, particularly in sunny areas, I just heard a talk the other day, and I'm going to take that word for it, that solar power is now getting, in cost, very competitive with carbon-based fuel. That does bring up another question, and that is solar power generated at a time when you don't need it necessarily. And so what they have to do is figure out better battery storage and better distribution capabilities on the grid. So the next stage is going to be battery grid to distribute the power from wind and solar and so forth. So I think we made significant progress, but you can go through the equation and calculate how much carbon you are likely to save if this begins to take place in its power source as a certain amount of it. Don't know the numbers. I did, if you like to read popular literature, there's a CNN reporter that has something called a 2-degree blog, and it's very interesting. And as one of his followers, he asked us about 4 weeks ago, what part of climate change did we, carbon generation, did we prefer him to look at? And the vote was to look at cows. And so he did. And it turns out cows, I won't go through the details of how they emit gases, but cows apparently are 18% of the greenhouse gas problem. And so we eat a lot of beef and we pay some of the price. And so whether or not you can change that part of the equation, I don't know. But clearly we've got to cut it down. We're pumping out 40 billion tons of carbon. That's impossible for us to maintain. We have to go down much, much lower. And I think we need to do the calculation. Rip and I were talking earlier that you've got groups here at Virginia Tech could sit down and say, what can we do, to cut that carbon, down to 30 million. And I think we really need to do that to figure out where the most, the low-hanging fruit is, if you will, in making that change. But in this country, it's going to be, a lot of it's going to be voluntary.
Okay. Another question? Yes, please.
Hey, Andrew.
I want to hear your opinion on the other side of the equation. Engineers have traditionally been very good at mitigating and building infrastructure. But on the adaptation side, how can engineers motivate the common citizen and consumer to adapt to climate change and change their needs so that they're using less energy and they can see that investing in coastal property is probably a thing of the past and not a thing of the future?
Okay. The question is, engineers are good at mitigation. How about the adaptation side? And what can we do to get the society start thinking about adaptation? Okay.
Well, to the American, I think a lot of people in the world, there are starting to think about this. As I mentioned, it's kind of a tipping point. I think more people are more aware of this issue, particularly since the Pope came out, than others. We all are buying more fuel-efficient cars. That's a step forward. We are using more natural gas. For better or worse, it's still a carbon-based fuel, but it's far less carbon-based than oil or coal. And so we are seeing a shift away from those levels. Now, partly that's driven by economics, and that's just a fact of life. But I think as more people learn, particularly children, they will adapt their habits to be, more aware of what they're doing to their own environment and to the environment of their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. So people can change their habits, and I think if there's this tipping point, you got to give credit to companies like Walmart, which really have emphasized sustainability. And they made a true effort to shift consumer choices to things that are environment-friendly and are carbon-friendly sources. And you're seeing more and more companies. GE just made a commitment that they're making the shift towards a commitment to providing us with consumer things that we need that are environmentally conscious and environmentally benign. And I think that will help all of us when we do that. But more of that is put on the table, the better it will be. But each person can make a difference. Now, I'm sure Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech has, for example, committed itself to a zero carbon-based campus. And so more and more institutions can make the commitment, and in doing it, they can bring their students into that idea of being certainly more aware of the problems that are being created by carbon.
Okay. Another question? Yes, please.
In the example 55 million years ago, the carbon level was so much higher. And apparently the Earth healed itself. And there have been other cycles. What can you learn from that?
Good.
Well, 55 million ago, the carbon level was 1,000 ppm, and it looks like the Earth healed itself. So the question is, what do you think now?
Okay, the is not an exact analog for today, and everybody knows that. But it's close, and the reason it's close is, we live on a constantly shifting plates on the Earth, and they're constantly moving around. And if you look at 55 million years ago, and you can all see this now on your websites, at the plates shifting around, most of the continents were in the exact same place they are today, except South America and North America hadn't finished connecting through the isthmus and so forth. So when people look at the Pedum, they see a world that was probably warmer than it is today to start with, but somewhat similar. Not, you know, because if you had Pangaea or something, the original supercontinent, you couldn't say that was similar. But it looked similar, and there was this period when there was this strong excursion in carbon, because before this, the volcanic eruptions and so forth, the carbon levels in the Paleocene were not too different from the carbon levels we have today. And so there was this excursion that took carbon levels from probably 300 or something on that order all the way up over 1,000 over a couple thousand years. And my friend Scott Wing, who studied this and studied it, calls that the all hell breaking loose period, when it just happened very quickly. But keep in mind that we are pumping carbon in at least 5 times faster today than was emitted in the Paleocene and Eocene period. So it's believed by many scientists that this has an analog for us to learn from. And the nice thing is you don't get in this argument about whether or not humans are causing it, because we weren't there. Our ancestors were there. There were little scurrying around mammals who had survived the dinosaurs and were still around and became us.
What's the future for carbon sequestration?
What's
Carbon
the future for
sequestration.
carbon sequestration?
Carbon sequestration, of course, is another mitigation tool, and it's been studied, and there's reasons to believe it would work. And I think we should try everything we can try. We're at that stage, and I'll bring that idea of trying everything we can try to another level in a minute. But carbon sequestration, the idea is to capture the carbon at, say, a power plant. Hard to capture it from transportation. That's more of a power plant kind of thing. And store the carbon deep in the earth. Store it in the ocean if you can, because the ocean can still absorb carbon. But there's still issues associated with that. Will you cause fractures in the earth that would cause earthquakes? Will it leak out at some point in time? Those kind of things. There's still questions to be answered, although I think carbon sequestration has a role potentially. There have been proposed, and many of you may have seen the article, something called geoengineering, which takes that one step further. And the idea is to shoot up into the atmosphere a series of particles that would act like a volcanic explosion in its early stages, actually cools the earth because it reflects the heat away from the earth. And volcanoes eventually heat the earth because of carbon. But in the early days, it happened not too long ago. The temperatures cooled a little bit because of a volcanic eruption. So geoengineering is the idea, is that somehow you could actually have a device or series of devices around the world that would pump these particles up into the atmosphere and reflect heat away. The problem with that is that you'd have to get everybody to agree to it. That doesn't seem to be very likely. And there are unintended consequences. People could starve because their crops wouldn't grow in certain places they've been growing before. So I don't see that that's happening. Some people argue we should continue to research it because we may hit a point in our race with carbon that you have to do this for, say, 20 years. If someone could say in 20 years I'll have this all figured out, you might do something like that. But those kind of things are still in the research stage. And I think coming back to what Walter said there's more low-hanging fruit out there where we can make a difference faster if we could get it going.
Well, I think one of the opportunities from what you said would be in our own ag department here in dealing with the cow problem, and that we can do methane recovery systems for that. My question deals with the area around Tidewater and Norfolk, Virginia Beach. Given that there is and I'm not going to use the correct term, a receding or a lowering because of the opposite effect that occurred from the glacial impacts is now releasing, and that land on its own,
Yes, the land subsiding.
and that's going to expedite that. Well, in light of that, possibly considering relocating or refacilitating all of our naval complex that we have down there, say, further up or someplace different in that part, and planning for that.
Yep.
Because if they are under
Yep.
15 feet of water, you have nothing to service.
Right, okay. Did everybody get that question? The question about Norfolk, and I neglected to say that, and a very good point, is that the area around Norfolk is subsiding, and so that exacerbates the problem of sea level coming up and the land subsiding. Same thing's happening in New Orleans. New Orleans is a subsided space, and so it gets worse in New Orleans because the land's going down and the sea's coming up, so you get the double whammy effect. I think that's obviously up to the military, and to a point they can adapt. They can protect it with seawalls and various other ways to try to protect it. At some point, that will be a failing strategy. and they'll have to move it. And it's not just Norfolk. There are other places where Charleston and other places that are highly susceptible to these issues. And so that's why reading that defense report is it catches your eye, because they have big problems. And it's not just here. They're in the Philippines. They're in a lot of places. That subsidence and sea level rise are going to be big problems. So our military is very concerned about. Now, the military is not just concerned, incidentally, about those kind of facilities issues. They're concerned because in many places you're going to have droughts and you're going to have huge battles over water. There's no question about that. And they think the chances of conflict are going to be much greater in the future because of these problems as well. So it's a very interesting report to read, but the point is well taken. I don't know when they make the decision to say, we're losing this battle.
Some questions from the back? Question? As you know, the kinetics are a very important part of the engineering equation as well. How optimistic are you that we'll have the political will and the technology to avoid some of the most serious consequences that you mentioned?
So the kinetics are very important. How important it is or how difficult it is, how possible it is for our politicians and public at large to get around to make those changes.
What was the first part of it?
The kinetics, you said, I think, if you would.
I just said that kinetics are a very important part of engineering, and I'm curious, what are your thoughts? How optimistic are you that we will be able to make the steps needed to avoid some of the most serious consequences?
How optimistic am I that we can do it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That's why I'm giving this talk. I think we need to be energized about this. And I think the other thing that's missing, you see, is there are no engineers saying anything. And engineers should be saying, this is a serious problem. And telling people, as an example, we can't protect you. You know, we can't do it. Right now, as you well know, the American Society of Civil Engineers issues a report about infrastructure on a regular basis, and we get an F. We're not even taking care of our bridges, you know. So we're going to get the money to build walls all over the place. So the challenges we face are significant challenges, and if engineers are not there, somebody will make the decision, and we'll end up having to live with it. And I don't think that's the position we should be in. But I think the key is, and that's what the Pope is saying, is let's get serious about this. And the Pope, if you read his encyclical, I'm not a Catholic, my wife is, but I'm not. But he says, I don't know the answers, and I'm just repeating what he said. I don't know the answers either. But he says we have to talk about it. And he said there are people out there who can help us get to an answer. And if we don't talk about it, we won't get to an answer, and we'll all be left to our own resources, and serious problems will occur. I think that's a very important step for us as engineers. So if you were asking me the dynamics of it, clearly, as we discussed with Walter, we need to move fast as we can on some of these mitigation technologies. We do need to thinking about how do you protect Charleston, which is now being flooded by sea level rises in the Battery District 3 or 4 times a year. It's coming to Charleston. It's coming to Norfolk. We need to be thinking about those. But we need to also be thinking about how we help energize the discussion and not simply wait on somebody else to tell us what the answer is. So I would say that's the most important thing for us to do.
There was a question from that end. Yes, please.
Yeah, just along the same lines of being energetic about this discussion, do you see it in institutions such as Georgia Tech or Tech? Do you see it as a responsible thing for these universities to perhaps remove their investment, their $100 million endowments from fossil fuel companies, recognizing the importance of this issue and the severity of this issue?
So the question is, like going on along the lines that was talked about earlier, what can we do? Can universities like Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech, can they take $100 million, for example, from their endowment and invest that into mitigating this problem?
Well, I think that's an interesting idea. The problem with those endowments is they're invested by a financially driven strategy. And they're looking, and in some cases, the investments do go into green investments, not necessarily, though, specifically for that purpose a lot of times. But I don't think, if you look at it, $100 million investment, it's not a big one, frankly, against the size of this problem, which is monstrous. The other side of the coin, however, is Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech have donors. And so I was fortunate to know a great donor named Michael Tenenbaum, who's a Georgia Tech friend of mine, who got fascinated when I told him we were setting up marine observatories around the world, and he gave us $10 million. because he loves the oceans and he's a scuba diver, he's very concerned. So that's money that goes directly into the system, and it makes a difference because we're funding a specific science effort. I think that's more direct and tangible rather than taking some money out of an endowment and putting it in as a broad-based investment somewhere. And it would have more immediate effect. I can guarantee you we're building that marine network as we speak because Michael Tenenbaum gave us $10 million. And so you can get donors interested in these issues because they support your school, they support the students, and particularly the students of the future. And they can make contributions, they can make a difference. And universities can do that.
All right, one front and one at the back, and that might be.
Okay, wait, so following on with this getting people energized idea, what is your elevator speech to somebody who's perhaps not convinced that this temperature variation is man-made?
Yeah.
So he's looking for your elevator speech for people who may not be convinced.
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I've tried a lot of different things. I don't know that I've got the first one. What I try to tell people is I've had an experience that very few people have had at the Smithsonian, and I've seen the natural world in so many different places. I can tell you the natural world is changing dramatically, faster than we ever thought, because of carbon pouring into the air, and it's threatening us. It's threatening you. It's not so much you, it's threatening your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. And you should be concerned, very concerned, because if you're not, and we miss this, the other thing about this, and the Pope said this, and others have too, President Obama, is this is not something we can do 50 years from now. 50 years from now, if we come to the conclusion this is a serious problem, it'll be 50 years too late. Because we will already have pumped, remember, 2,000 billion tons of carbon in the air. And we would be starting from zero to try to get these mitigation efforts to work. And they take time. This research takes time. And then actually application research, getting industry to build out the infrastructure for solar cells, it takes time. So it is an urgency, I think, that people, to my mind, that's the thing that's hard to get across because it seems far away. If you think about it, people say, well, we can't do something like this, but we have. Because when we worried about fluorocarbons and hairsprays, we stopped doing it, and we saved the ozone layer. Still got a hole up there, but it's not as big as it used to be. When we got worried about DDT killing off these great species like bald eagles and so many others and damaging our own genome, we stopped doing it. We can decide to do something as a nation. And I think this is one of those times when, as a nation, we have to come together and think together about it.
Okay, one more question from the back. Okay, if not, let's give Dr. Rao another big hand. Dr. Clough, I would like to offer a special thanks to you for this thought-provoking lecture. And I think I can guarantee you, or I can assure you, that we at Virginia Tech will do our very best to take the interdisciplinary research to solve and take this challenge up. So thank you very much again for bringing us to this place. As a token of small appreciation, would like to give this gift. Okay, all right, give it. Welcome. Thank you very much. Yes.